Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for February 23, 2022, the Russia Invades edition. We'll begin with that story as apparently Russia has now invaded, or perhaps not, Ukraine. They have moved troops into disputed territories. But for the compliance professional, the situation is that President Biden, in a televised announcement today from the White House, said that the U.S. would join with Europe in silverman Russia with some sanctions. These are not the death penalty sanctions that have been bandied about or that Matt Silverman talked about in this week's episode of Compliance, or rather the FCPA Compliance Report, but it's the first round and it's certainly designed to hurt. What Putin will do at this point, of course, is unknown, but there'll be no meeting between Putin and Biden now, and the U.S. Secretary of State has canceled his meeting with his Russian counterpart, so things are not looking good. If you really like a good review of the sanctions that are under consideration and have been enacted, check out this week's offering on the FCPA Compliance Report. Matt Silverman, trade compliance expert, goes through all of the sanctions. And check out next week where he says what you can do to either get ready or implement them from the corporate perspective. Next up, from the Asia Times, President Biden's Southeast Asia policy pivots to anti-corruption. Back in December, Washington published the first ever strategy on countering corruption. And according to the Asia Times, this is a bit of revolutionary thinking, as it's hard to see how anyone could separate corruption and human rights. And this certainly applies to Asia. So, pivot on corruption. Next up, Carl Icahn is taking on McDonald's over pig welfare. Billionaire activist Carl Icahn has set his sights on McDonald's, picking a corporate fight with the fast food giant over its treatment of pig sourced for its pork supply. McDonald's made a splashy commitment back in 2012, which it has not yet made good on this promise, and Icahn is using this to try to gain leverage with the company. Whether it's green mail, black mail, blue mail, or anything else is unknown at this point. And of course, Carl Icahn is one of the most savvy investors over the past 30 years or so in Wall Street. So it shows that if a company makes a commitment, it needs to stick to that commitment. And finally, for those who may not remember, last year was the worst winter storm in Texas since the 1890s. The state's power grid completely failed the state, and we were out without power on and off for over 5 days. And now the first lawsuit around that, where the state of Texas tried to push off the payment to customers, is going to trial to determine who was at fault. So although the Texas governor and the Texas legislature failed to do anything to address these issues, it is in court. So it's going to be interesting to see what the courts may find. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.